Step 4. A week passed, then another one, and summer rolled into the busiest part of itself. The elevator was humming, sometimes with trucks waiting in line to bring the grain in and dump it and go back for more. Farmers worked until dark, and Fred stayed open often until midnight or later so they could bring in the last trucks of the grain for the day. Then, the next morning, they would start at daylight, and we'd have to be open not long after then to be ready for them, truck after truck rolling in to dump their golden grain. The dust so thick, even inside the office you could choke on it, and no way to stop. There was so much paperwork that I had to be there almost all the time with Fred just to keep up, totaling the grain amounts and filing them in the old wooden filing cabinets next to the peanut machine. I didn't think it would ever end, and I took to taking morning walks just after we opened the doors. There was a short, quiet time just at dawn before the trucks started to come in from the fields. Just an hour or so, and I would take Python, and we would walk through the town. Bolton was so small that after a couple of times you'd think you knew it all, but there was always something different happening. The birds were always singing, and the sun wasn't hot yet, and I wasn't covered with grain dust yet, and Python seemed to like it. I let him pick the way to go, just moving along next to me, his shoulder against my leg, and on one of the morning walks he took me so that I met the artist Mrs. Langdon had sent forward to make the war memorial, Mick. Although at first I didn't know he was the artist. At first, I thought he was a pervert. Python and I always walked a different way. Sometimes we'd move through the small downtown area because Hopper's Bakery would be taking out the first rolls of the day. The smell of fresh bread came out of the back doors of the bakery into the alley and made our mouths water. Hopper would come to the door and give us each a roll, and Python would take his ever so gently, and we'd eat them hot and steaming. Sometimes we'd go down in back of Lyle's Weak Beer Emporium because Lyle had a thing about cats and must have had a dozen of them, and Python liked to put them up the power poles. He didn't catch them, and maybe even didn't want to, but it was fun for him once in a while to decorate the power poles with them, and it probably kept the cats from getting too careless. This morning, Python had taken me by the bakery, and Hopper had given us each a sticky cinnamon roll. Python wasn't much on manners, so he'd taken his down kind of in one gulp. I ate mine slower, and when I was done, my hands were all over sticky, so I let Python lick them. We were standing at one end of the alley, and I looked up while he was licking my hands, and there was Mick. Actually, there was an old station wagon with rust so bad it looked to be falling apart. The back window was rolled halfway down, and the left front fender was patched over with silver duct tape until you couldn't see anything but tape. Jammed in the driver's side window was the bottom of a man. It had clothes on, the bottom, but there it was, filling the window, and I stopped. Python made that sound low in his throat so you thought that the ground was shaking. I knew all about perverts from what the nuns had told us, or sometimes hadn't told us, in the orphanage, and also what we learned in school, so I thought naturally I was seeing a pervert. I also thought, just as naturally, how that pervert would feel if I let Python go and he took about half of that bottom off for a snack to follow up his cinnamon roll. But something held me back. It didn't seem right for a pervert to be sitting with his bottom propped in the side of an old station wagon window at dawn in Bolton, Kansas. Plus, it wasn't moving. It's dead, maybe, I told Python. It's a dead bottom. Python rumbled again. I moved closer. I know how that sounds. Stupid. Everybody says if you see a pervert, get away from him, and everybody is right. But I moved closer. Maybe it was because I was dumb, or maybe because I half figured nobody in his right mind would bother me with Python standing next to me. Whatever the reason, I moved closer. 2 steps, then 2 more. Still the bottom didn't move. Just stood there in the window. I thought maybe the joke was bad because somebody really was dead, The way it was so still. When I was 10 feet away, it moved just a bit to the side. I leaned, and I heard a moan so low there was almost a chop to it, a kind of a oh, oh, oh. Then there was a fumbling sound, a click, as somehow he reached back through between his legs and operated the door handle. The door creaked open, and I was looking at a man standing on his head in the front seat of the station wagon, looking at me back between his knees. Only he didn't see me, he saw Python. Oh, God, it's death. Death coming for me. I've gone too far this time. I'm gone. Gone. Then he saw me, looking still up and back through his legs, and he smiled. Well, that is, his mouth seemed to smile upside down, and he coughed. Tell me, are you with death? I didn't say anything. It still was in my mind that this was a pervert, and I was ready to run or put Python on him, either one. No, he answered himself. Death wouldn't come with a girl. Why then? Why are you with that thing? It's not a thing, it's a dog. His name is Python, and if you're a pervert, he's going to make lunch out of your rear end. Pervert? Yes. Well, I've been called lots of things and will be called more, but pervert isn't one of them. How is it then that you're standing upside down in a car with your bottom sticking out of the window if you're not a pervert? It was the way I happened to be, he said, when I fell asleep. Passed out, more likely, I thought, but I didn't say anything. Hell, I thought any old pervert with his salt wouldn't tell me if he was a pervert anyway. He'd just wait and do his pervert things, and I thought for half a second about turning Python loose anyway, just on general principle, when the man suddenly moved. His feet had been propped somehow on the ledge next to the door, and with the door open, there wasn't anything to hold him on the ledge, and they slipped off, both feet. He was wearing tennis shoes that looked to be made of rags, dropped to the ground. The legs and bottom followed, and he bounced off the seat with his face kicked sideways off the back of the car seat, rolled half over, and was sitting on the ground by the car looking up at me right side up. Hello? He squinted. My eyes are bleeding. No, they're not. You're just drunk. Not true. I was drunk. Now I'm not, and my eyes are bleeding. You wouldn't have a bottle somewhere, would you? No. I thought of Fred's bottle in the elevator, but didn't say anything about it. You don't need it anyway. I think I was going to say more about how he drank too much, but he wasn't listening to me. God, look at that. See the light? What light? There. The light coming by the old wall. See how it comes down gold and across your face? Oh, God. See it? See the light? It comes down across you like a blessing, like a kiss from the gods. I've got to get it. Get it. Stay there. Just stay there. Stay there. Don't move. And all the time he was talking, he had moved around to the rear of the car and was rummaging in the back of the station wagon, pulling at what looked like a bunch of junk to me, folders and boxes and paper sacks. In a few seconds, he found a tablet and a small box that he brought to the hood of the car. Don't move. Don't move. I had no intention of moving. It was coming to me now what he was, the thought, and I was wondering what it would do to Bolton. You know, kind of like a garden gnome, one of the statues that Clyde Fresner had in his yard and garden, round and short with red faces, all smiling, all happy, but with some little thing in their eyes, some wicked little thing that made them look like they were always on the edge of doing something wrong. His eyes had the same look, the tip up at the corners, and he had a small beard and was bald on top and looked all mussed and devilish. Even his clothes looked like they came off a garden gnome. He had a bright red shirt over a pale green pair of stretched slacks that looked like they'd been on him for about a year. There were stains down the front of his shirt that I didn't care to look at or think about much. He opened the box to show a bunch of pieces of colored chalk. He flipped the top of the tablet back to get to a clean piece of paper and grabbed a chunk of dark-colored chalk from the box and drew. "Don't move. Not a muscle." He sketched fast, his head bent over the tablet, his hand flying in great motions round and round, and when I leaned forward to see, he yelled at me, "Don't move!" Python rumbled at the way his voice jumped, but he didn't even notice that. Didn't notice death. He just kept sketching. "The light. See the light?" His voice was a whisper while he worked, a hushed sound, almost like praying, and in a few minutes he was done. "There, I've got it. Just notes, see? Just notes. But I can paint it later if I can find somewhere in this place with light, with a room to work in. That's it. Don't you see? Just a dry room and light. Good. Light is everything." And here a strange thing happened. While he was talking, his voice soft about light and how he needed a dry room while he was going on, Python walked over to him, put his jaw against the man's leg, just pushed his muzzle over, and the gnome reached down and petted him. Without losing a finger. Python had never let another soul touch him, and here he walks right up to this complete stranger who could have been a pervert and lets him touch him on the head. "You're the artist," I said. "The one they sent for to do the monument?" "Mick," he said. "Mick. Well, any last name you want. Just Mick. It doesn't matter. Names don't matter, do they? Only the light matters. The light and the way colors move in the light, that's all. And shapes. Line. It's all in the line." And all this time he's petting Python, rubbing his head. "But aren't you the one for the monument?" "Well, that goes, doesn't it? What in blue bonnet hell would I be doing in the place if I wasn't sent for? I know nothing of farming or wheat or flatness, only line and color and form and shading. See, look now. Turn and look, girl, at the light coming across the face of that building. Look at how it catches the bricks so that you can see the soul of the men who laid them. See the guts of the men who made the building. See? There it is." And he turned to a new page in the tablet and started to draw again. This time he wasn't doing me so I could move, and I stood in back of him and watched him draw. It didn't make any sense. The lines seemed to fly all over the place, all in browns and reds and yellows, sometimes one over the other and all mixed. I didn't see how it could make anything but junk, just junk, and suddenly it did. Suddenly it was all there. All the dust and light from the sun and the bricks in the old Emerson building that used to be a hardware store but now was empty. All of it was there. And the light. I can see it," I said. "I can really see it. How did you do that?" "It's not me, is it? It's the light. It's the way the thing is, the way of it, and I just make it be the way it is, like over there, over by that old fence. See how it comes out there and the shadows fall in the dirt by the road?" And he was off again, the pad out in front of him this time, his fingers folding different pieces of chalk as he moved. Python followed, and I followed, and watched him work. Once when I looked down, Python was looking at the chalk as well, watching it fly around the paper. "How did you get here?" I asked. "I mean, if you see all these things to draw all the time, how do you get anywhere?" He stopped and looked at me. "Ah, yes, there it is, isn't it? I haven't a clue. Drunk, I suppose. Drunk is the only way I can seem to get anywhere. I have a drink now and then." "You do?" I thought of Fred and Emma. They had a drink now and then. Mick swam in it. When he moved now, I could sometimes smell him, smell his clothes, and Python didn't seem to mind, but then Python liked to roll on dead skunks on the highway when he could find them. Mick's clothes made me want to stop breathing, but I followed him. Even the smell didn't stop me. He kept moving, and I kept following him. Sometimes you don't see things, and time will go by, and then you'll look and see it. In the orphanage, we always thought Sister Jean Autry was kind of ugly because she had such a square face and big jaw. But later, and then still later after, I was adopted by Emma and Fred and woke up every morning happy. Later, I could sit and think of Sister Jean Autry as being kind of beautiful. And maybe she wasn't, but that's how I remember her now. I wrote a letter to her to tell her, sort of, without telling her how I thought that she was beautiful now, but it embarrassed me, and I never did mail it. But I wish I had, although that's not the same. That's what happened now. While I was following Mick, I'd been in Bolton for years, and what with walking now every morning while we worked through the hard part of harvest, I thought I knew everything about it, how it looked and acted, but I was wrong. I didn't know anything. Not really. Mick went through town like a chalk storm, the little colored bits in one hand and the tablet in the other. The town, see it? It's all there, all right there. And he would stop and draw. Once he drew the corner, just the corner, of Henderson's old white house. It was an abandoned house on the stretch of 3rd and Elm. I always just thought of it as an empty house, just a box that nobody used anymore. Fred had told me once that there had been a large, happy family there, but hard times had come in the 30s, and they had all left, and nobody ever heard of them again. Not a word. Somehow that came into the drawing. I watched Mick work, saw the lines happen and the colors, and just from the corner of the old house felt all the loneliness of the family being gone. All of it. It made me think of Sister Jean Autry, and I swore to myself I would write her another letter and mail it this time, and Mick moved on. On a back street, he stopped by a small green house where Mr. Jennings lived. Mr. Jennings was so old that not even Fred and Emma knew how long he'd been in Bolton. Fred thought he was over 100, and when I watched Mr. Jennings come out for mail once to the box on the street, I agreed. It seemed to take him about a week to walk out and walk back, and he had this old dog named Rex who slept on the front steps. Rex would get up and walk with Mr. Jennings out to the street for the mail. Step by step, and together they made you think of old, dusty, dead, and old. Mick did a drawing of Rex on the porch, and Rex didn't move even though Python was there, which sometimes made Rex raise his head, and when he was done, I could see Rex as a young dog. He was still old and not moving, and the house was still small and green, and Mr. Jennings was still old, but I could in some way see them all young and new. I could see Rex, how he must have been when he was young, with tall shoulders and pretty fur and bright eyes. The drawing made me want to know Mr. Jennings young, know what he was like when he was a young man. I decided, just because of the drawing, to ask around and find out all I could about him. "How do you do that?" I asked, but he ignored me. Kept going and drawing until I realized that I was late for work and Fred would have to handle the paperwork for the loads without me. He could do it, but it made things slower, and the farmers would have to wait in line longer. That made them mad because they wanted to get back to their fields. "I have to go," I said, but he was doing a tree limb near the school, just a limb that hung out over the elementary playground fence, and he didn't hear me or didn't care. I turned to go. Python didn't come. "Are you staying with him?" I asked. It was the first time he'd ever done that. Stayed when I'd got ready to leave. He turned at last and came to me, leaned in so I could take his shoulder. We walked 4 blocks back to the grain elevator while Mick stayed to draw the town. There was a long line of trucks, and Fred looked all frazzled. "I was about to send somebody to find you." I slid in behind the desk. "The man came, the artist." "Oh, he did? When?" "Must have been last night sometime. I found him asleep in his station wagon." "In his car? Didn't he know they had a room saved for him at Carlson's bed?" "I guess not." Well, maybe he did, I thought. Widow Carlson had heard about a new thing for small towns, bed and breakfast inns, on some television show that she'd seen, and decided she should turn her house into one. just to pick up a few dollars," she said to Fred and Emma in the grocery store one day when we was shopping. "To help tide a woman over, the rough spots." Fred told me later the widow Carlson had about as much money as a small European country, having owned 7 square miles of prime wheat land that her husband left to her. Maybe she just needed something to do. The problem was, Bolton is off the path to just about anywhere in the world, and nobody ever came except grain and cattle buyers. They spent the nights in Lyle's wheat beer emporium until near morning, buying and selling grain and cattle, and then driving on without actually sleeping the night anywhere. So when nobody came, Widow Carlson just more or less saved the breakfast portions for the next time, which was 2 hard-boiled eggs. And like Fred once said, the eggs must have hair on them by this time. Stick and Mick in there would just about kill him, especially if he tried to eat one of the eggs. "Maybe we should go find him," Fred said, "and tell him where to go." I shrugged. "He was over by old man Jennings' place last I saw him." "What was he doing over there?" "Drawing." "Drawing pictures?" I nodded. "Looks like he's going to draw the whole town unless he runs out of paper." "Just drawing pictures as he goes?" "Yup." The dust was coming into the office bad now from the dumping trucks, and I used my fingers to clean out the corner of my eyes. "His hands just fly." "Is that a fact?" Fred stopped with his handkerchief halfway to blow in his nose. "Are the drawings good?" I thought a minute. I don't know. I think they are, but I don't know anything about what makes a good drawing. I know this: they make you think. Make me see things I didn't see before. He did a drawing of old man Jennings' dog Rex, and I saw Rex like he must have been when he was young." Fred blew his nose and then carefully folded his handkerchief and put it away. "I'd like to see that. I really would." "I could take you if you didn't have all this to do. He's just 3 blocks away." He looked at me. "What do you think?" "Fred, there's 3 trucks waiting." "We'll take 'em with us." "We will?" "Sure. There might not be a chance to see something like this again ever." He thought a minute and then took 3 cold Cokes out of the machine, poured half of each out the window, and filled them from the bottle in the sack, and walked out the door. One truck was dumping grain. There was a farmer named Hanson there, and 2 more were waiting. He handed Hanson one of the Cokes, went to the other 2 farmers and gave them each a Coke and talked to each of them a little. Pretty soon I was walking down the street with Python by my side and 4 big men following along behind. We had to walk past the hardware and grocery, then along the side of Bemis's all-service station. 5 people walking like that attracted attention, so we picked up one here and one there until I looked back and we had 9 men and 3 women following, none of them talking, just following in the early morning behind Python and me. We found Mick another block down from where he'd been. He was doing a drawing of an old car up on blocks in back of Harrison's house. It was an old Ford, and Mick was leaning the tablet against a tree while he worked. I stopped in back of him and watched him draw. All the people with me formed a rough circle around the back of me, and if Mick saw us, or even knew we were there, he made no sign. His fingers whipped the chalk around, and the car came into being on the paper. When he came to doing the small oval emblem that said Ford in written letters, I heard somebody in back of me cough and say, when Harrison was young, he went to sparking in the car, and he used to shine it so that emblem just stood out, caught the light and stood out, just like on that drawing. How could that be? And so it did. And when he was done with the old car, he moved on. Only this time he didn't fold the drawing into the tablet. He tore it from the pad. He handed it to Fred, who took it, looked at it, and passed it on to the rest of the people. There was no sound except for breathing. I thought, it might be because they didn't like the drawing, but it was the other way. They saw what I saw, or thought I saw that the drawings were more than just drawings, was somehow inside of what they were drawing of, so that they showed all of what that thing had been or would be. Showed not just the old car, but in some strange way what made the thing that way, how it lived and maybe died. Mick was drawing now by Harrison's mailbox, how it leaned out and over the curb, the way the shadow from it went. His hand started the big looping movements to form things, and when he suddenly stopped, his nose went to the air. "Could it be," he said, "that there is something drinkable nearby?" Fred nodded and held out the Coke bottle that he was carrying. No, I didn't mean anything sweet." Fred said nothing, just held the Coke bottle out. Something in his eyes went to Mick, and Mick nodded and took the bottle and drank back about half of it. "There," he sighed. "I've been a touch off since I woke up this morning in that strange position, and that helps. That helps." He studied us as if seeing us for the first time. "Now, tell me, where'd you all come from?" It came to me that night that I should be an artist. Well, not that fast. It wasn't just one of those silly things you hear about where somebody watches a video and decides to be a rock star or a rodeo rider or an airline pilot. Not wacky like that, or not like we used to do in the orphanage when we would study pictures and magazines and try to imagine how it would be to live the way that they live in the pictures. It was not from what Mick was doing, not from how he lived, not that. Who wants to live in a rusty old station wagon drunk all the time with your rear end sticking out the window and not knowing where you are? It was something else. Not something that Mick did so much as what his work made me want to do. If I could have wrapped the rest of that first day in plastic and kept it in a box forever to take out and look at and play with, I would have been happy. Mick moved through the whole town. The grown-ups left after a little time to get back to what they were doing, and I started to follow them as well. Python stayed with Mick again, and I had to call him to break him away, but Fred stopped me. "The elevator will run fine without you for a while if you want to stay. It's all right. He's just going to draw more pictures, and what is that to watch?" But he knew. Fred knew that I really wanted to see it, and see all of it, and he shook his head. "Things like this come along, you've got to see them, especially if you're young. You stay, and I'll keep up as best as I can. Then you can tell me all about it at supper tonight. You be my eyes." So I stayed with Mick almost the rest of the day until Mrs. Langdon found him. Until then, he just kept moving, working, drawing so that he filled the tablet, and when it was full he turned it over and started to draw on the backs of the papers he'd already drawn on. It didn't matter to him. Once he saw something small, some little thing that I couldn't see. He lowered to his hands and knees and crawled into a shrub by the Walters place, dragging the tablet behind him. "What are you doing?" Come see. Come see. Oh, it's the most lovely thing, the most lovely, lonely thing of all. Come see." I didn't want to crawl into any old bush. The Walterses had about 7 dozen kids, from diapers filled to older than me, and the older ones had a way of teasing that made me not want to embarrass myself. But Python followed him in. I couldn't let Python follow where I wouldn't go, so I scrabbled down. It was hard because of my leg, and I looked in. Light came down through the bush and showed on a small place, just a little circle inside the bush, and there was a tiny cross made of popsicle sticks where one of the Walters kids had buried a gerbil or a dead bird. It didn't matter what was buried there, not to Mick. He pulled the pad in with him, and I watched him make the light and the little circle and the 2 crossed popsicle sticks. While he worked, I saw his face, and he was crying. Tears moving down through the grime of sleeping in the car and the dust under the bush, crying while he worked until he was done. I could see it then. see the sadness of the little grave and the way the light hit the popsicle sticks. When we were walking down the sidewalk with the cracks where the elm tree roots were pushing up, I asked him about it. How could you see that? Where the popsicle stick grave was? It didn't show. I couldn't see it until I got in there. How could you see that walking by on the sidewalk? He stopped and scratched his head around the bald spot with his fingernails. Bits of dust and dirt came out. It had to be there, didn't it? What do you mean? Just that. It had to be there, didn't it? A child simply had to go in there and bury a wee bird or animal. It was the place it had to be, and I knew it was there. Just as I know this woman is coming is after me and not you. I turned, and there came Mrs. Langdon, walking so fast the band that went around her head to hold her glasses almost flew out in back of her hair. "Mr. Strum!" she yelled half a block away. "Oh, Mr. Strum, I didn't know you'd arrived." Who is she? He scratched his stomach, which was covered with different colored straps of chalk where the board had left marks while he worked. "Mrs. Langdon," I said. "Ha, the one who wrote me?" He nodded. "It's not good," he said aside to me, his voice lowered, "when they call you Mister that way. Only people who want something call you that. Bill collectors, or rich bankers who want you to make their nose look better than it is. It was either Oscar Wilde or Whistler or Sargent who said an oil portrait is a painting with something wrong with the mouth. Or was it the nose? Silly, isn't it?" But he turned toward her and smiled. "Hello, Mr. Strum," Mrs. Langdon said. It was the first time I had heard his last name. "Mr. Strum, when did you arrive?" Mick looked at me, a question in his eyes. "Last night," I said. "I think he got here late last night. He was here this morning, sleeping in his car." I did not add how he was sleeping. "But you were supposed to contact me when you arrived. You had a nice room for you at Carlson's bed and breakfast." "It was necessary," Mick said, rising on his feet, "to capture the ambiance of the town, the soul of the town. I could hardly have done that in the comfort of a soft bed." Of course. But I could tell that he wasn't serious. His voice had changed, and out of the corner of his eye I thought I saw him wink at me. Still he smiled at Mrs. Langdon and nodded. "I will accompany you now," he said, "as soon as I have paid my assistant." He looked back through the tablet and tore loose the drawing of Jennings' dog Rex and handed it to me. "For you." But I didn't do anything. More than you know. More than you'll ever know. In the orphanage, when you get something that you didn't argue about it, there weren't that many things to come your way, but I was trying to change some of those things from the way that I did them back then, like grabbing at food or thinking of myself all the time, but I held back the once, and that was enough. "Thank you. You're very welcome. I will need your assistance again on the morrow. Perhaps you could meet me, along with your trusted companion," he pointed to Python, "in the morning at the aforementioned bed and breakfast, say at 8 o'clock. I had to work, of course. I couldn't leave Fred all alone at the grain elevator, but I thought that if I went for the rest of the afternoon and evening and straightened up the books out, maybe I could take some time in the morning, on the morrow, to meet Mick and help him. I'll try." "Very good." He turned to Mrs. Langdon. "And now, my dear, proceed." I watched them until they were near the corner. Mrs. Langdon was tall, and he was short, came just over her shoulders, and he bent to talk to him, her finger wagging and her head shaking, and it looked like somebody walking with a messy pet. Chalk dust seemed to poof off him with each step, and he was stained from the work, the drinking, the sleeping in the car. Just before he was out of hearing, I remembered something. "Don't eat the eggs," I called. "They're older than you." But he didn't hear me. The rest of that day, I worked at the elevator and brought all the books up to the minute and had them all ready so Fred could just enter things the next morning. We went home late, and I took a hot bath and sat in my bed in my pajamas and looked at the drawing Mick had given me and decided to be an artist. It was there, in the drawing, but in more too, in the way that it had been today, watching him work, watching him see things, see inside them. I put the drawing on a piece of cardboard and leaned it against the mirror on my little butch dressing table. I watched it until I was nearly asleep, remembering how he had done the lines, the colors, how he worked the chalk with his fingers to make Rex be something on the paper. Before I slept, there was a soft knock on the door, and Fred and Emma were there to say good night as they did each night before I went to sleep. It reminded me somehow of the orphanage, because Sister Jean Autry always came to say good night to us the same way. Emma tucked me in, and Fred ruffled my hair, and I lay back on the pillow. "I'm going to be an artist," I said. "It couldn't go any other way," Fred said, nodding. "Ain't he something?" "It's not just him," I said. "It's the drawing, all of it." "I know," Emma said. "You just let it grow and have a good time with it. That's the most important thing." She leaned down and kissed me on the forehead and touched my cheek with her hand, and that smelled of lilac water. Fred turned off the light so I could sleep, but I lay awake for a long time and stared at the drawing of the light that came in the window from the street light. It changed and changed until I thought it was moving, and then I went to sleep.